G'day you mob, welcome to this episode of Aussie English, the number one place for anyone and everyone wanting to learn Australian English, culture, history, news and current affairs, all that jazz, all that kind of stuff. So today I have a brilliant episode for you, although it runs on the long side of interview episodes. Today I am interviewing special guest Marek Kiczkowiak. So Marek is from Poland. He speaks 6 languages. He is one of the most qualified English teachers that I have ever spoken to on the podcast, with a CELTA, a BA in English Philology, and a PhD in TEFL from the University of York. He currently works for National Geographic Learning, as well as Université Libre de Bruxelles, developing an online academic English course. So today we have the pleasure of talking about TEFL Equity Advocates and Academy, which he has set up in order to support non-native teachers of English develop their skills and get those jobs as English teachers. And on top of that, more broadly, we talk about learning languages. We talk about polyglots. We talk about whether or not you should focus on things like grammar and pronunciation. We get into a lot of these different areas. So hang on to your hats, guys. Brace yourselves. It's a good episode. It's a bit of a long one, but I hope you enjoy it. Anyway, let's get into it, guys. I give you Marek Kiczkowiak. All right. I'm gonna see if I can nail this. I'm horrible with Polish surnames, although I should be good, as there are quite a lot of Polish immigrants in Australia. But Marek Kiczkowiak or Kiczkowiak? Or if I just... Kiczkowiak. All right. Sorry. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today, mate. I really appreciate it. Can you tell us about who you are and what you do?
Sure. Thanks for inviting me, Pete. I really appreciate it as well. I'm Marek, and I currently live in Belgium, but I'm originally from Poland, from a small town in the north of Poland. And I currently work in Université Libre de Bruxelles. I develop courses for teaching academic English for them, and I also work for National Geographic Learning, where I'm writing a course book for learning English. And I also have my own sort of freelance venture, TEFL Equity Advocates and Academy, which started as a blog really, and now it grew into a website. I run courses for English teachers, and basically the aim is to help English teachers promote equality in our profession and to teach English for global communication.
So how did you get to where you are today in terms of obviously living in Belgium, originally from Poland, speaking fluent English? I think I saw in your bio you speak probably 6 languages. Is it? How did you get to here today?
I think, as a lot of people, just step by step. I don't think there was anything kind of, magical to it. As all Polish people, I started learning English in school. And I had private classes. At that time, I'm not that old, but I was born just before the communism fell. So when I went to school, a lot of teachers, the level of English was unfortunately still low, because for 50 years, no English had been taught in Poland, So,
but to be fair, their Russian was probably pretty good.
Probably, yeah. All the Russian teachers were kind of made into English teachers. So,
wow.
So I also had private classes in language schools and stuff like this. And and at some point I got to like studying English and other languages, and I went to do what we call English philology in Poland, which is linguistics, English language, culture, literature, but also teaching English pedagogy. So I did a BA in it. Then I did a CELTA, which is the Certificate of English Language Teaching to adults. I did that, and then I decided to see the world and teach English abroad.
So was it that you wanted to teach English first and foremost, or was it that you wanted to see the world first and foremost?
I started teaching English in university part-time as a student, and I already discovered I liked it. But there was definitely this thing that I really wanted to travel and go somewhere far away and see the world. So I think I can't say which one was stronger, but definitely this drive to see the world pushed me to leave Poland, because I could have stayed teaching English in Poland, but I chose not to. And then I taught English in several different countries. I was in Costa Rica, in Spain, in Hungary, in the UK. Now I'm here in Belgium. And along the way, I also did the Delta, which is the diploma in English language teaching, and then most recently a PhD in teaching English as well.
Far out.
So it's been sort of like a step-by-step journey. I think if you had asked me when I finished university, if you had asked me then, well, are you going to do a PhD and work in a university in Belgium, I would have said, you must be crazy. It wasn't something I wanted at that time of my life, when I was 20. I wanted other things. And then sort of along the way, as you grow up, you kind of, your vision of life or your profession changes, and you want other things as well. So I think that's how it's changed. And I also, along the way, I developed also a desire to learn other languages. So, I had English and German in school, and then I started learning Spanish as well. And it kind of became part of, my passion really in my free time, learning other languages.
This is something I wanted to ask you about. I was going to ask you later on, but we've just gotten into it. What was the process like when you learned English compared to learning some of these other languages? Because to frame it better, I kind of have this chip on my shoulder about so-called polyglots, because a lot of them tend to be English native speakers. And I feel like they don't appreciate the difference between learning a foreign language when it's kind of like fun, it's a hobby, you can use it to travel, versus say someone like yourself learning English where this is no joke. It's, going to really help my career. I'm potentially living in foreign countries like Britain, like Australia. So I feel like they're not necessarily the same thing. And I feel that when I'm trying to learn French or Portuguese, I meet a lot of people who are French or Portuguese learning English, and I sort of see us as different animals. Did you see learning English as very sort of different from, say, learning Portuguese or French when you were doing it?
I think it was very different because of how I was learning it. So, I started learning English in public schools when I was 7, in the first grade, and it was never fun at any point. And I was going to language schools as a teenager, and it was absolutely the last thing I wanted to do in my free time, be in a classroom and learn English. I wanted to do other things, hang out with my mates and things like that. So and learning German as well in high school, it was never fun at any point. It was just having to learn it, and also I think there was a lot of, it was very traditional, so it was a lot of grammar, rather than communication. So I think these were the main differences. When I was learning English, I had no idea or no feeling that it would ever be good for me to learn English, because also at that time, internet was slowly kind of moving in, but few of my friends had internet. We didn't really watch YouTube, or Netflix didn't exist and stuff like this. So you were basically surrounded by Polish, and there were no other languages around, and there was, you didn't see any need that, all of a sudden you might need English in the future. That kind of, I think now perhaps for the generation that's now in school, it's completely different, because they're surrounded by English, whether they like it or not, and all jobs require English, right? So
exactly.
So I think maybe it's slightly different now.
But that's something I've noticed, where the most advanced English learners that I tend to meet aren't necessarily the most motivated and like, oh, I just love English, I love reading in English, I love Netflix. It's more, I'm disciplined as hell, and that's what's gotten me to my level. Whereas I find a lot of, even with me learning Portuguese, because I can kind of take it or leave it, it's not, my life isn't on the line. I treat it differently. What do you think the roles are in terms of motivation versus discipline in learning a language like English?
Well, I think, to reach a high proficiency level in any language, you need to be disciplined and motivated and conscientious, unless you do it as a child, right? But other than that, it's not that polyglots might kind of, it might seem for the outsider that it's all fun and games for them. They basically, and that's what I do. I'm speaking from experience as well. You find fun and enjoyable ways of learning the language, but you need to do it every day.
Yeah.
You know, you can't just make it fun and but not be conscientious about it, because then it's going to take 5 times as long, right? So it's just, I think that, you know, it wasn't fun for me to learn German in school because it was all grammar. I was reading text from the textbook I didn't want to read. I was listening to fake recordings of fake German speakers and stuff like this. Whereas, you know, when I'm learning Dutch now, I make it fun for myself. I go and watch a football game with my friends and drink a beer. I use apps for learning English because I like it. I will watch YouTube shows that I like. You know, I don't choose stuff that I don't like. So it's, you know, it's still hard work, I think, but it doesn't feel like it because you're doing stuff that you like in that language.
So what was your process like going through, I guess, with English, the different teachers and the different ways in which it was taught? You said you started from a sort of grammar focused traditional basis. Did your English suddenly take off when the teaching style changed?
I think throughout it was, I mean, there were some teachers where it was more communicative. Probably in language schools, it was more communicative than in the state schools. Also because in state schools, then, you know, the teachers are obliged to do tests and exams and things like that. You have more students in the classroom and things like that. But I think my English really took off when, you know, kind of when I was in my late teens and I started being interested in it. And I thought, oh, maybe I will study English. And I started, you know, it started to become a little bit more fun. I suppose it was more of an intrinsic motivation. But yeah, I think that the teaching style differed depending on the teacher a little bit as well.
Yeah, I guess I wanted to attach that to TEFL, Equity Advocates and Academy, and how you guys are obviously supporting foreign speakers of English as being, you know, good quality teachers, if not better than many native speakers of English who end up teaching English. But I wanted to know, are there certain ways of teaching that are much more efficient too, obviously?
I mean, I think it all comes down to your proficiency level, your skills as a teacher, your experience, right? Your qualifications. I think these are the base, and your personality as well in the classroom, obviously. But these are the basic things that make a good or a bad teacher. And obviously, if you have a teacher whose proficiency level is lower than your own as a learner, that's a problem, right? Or equally, you could have a teacher who is incredibly proficient but doesn't know how to teach, right? There's all sorts of different variables.
I consider myself that at times. For a long time when I was beginning, I'm like, I teach English, but then I was sort of coming to that realization of, no, I create content that people use to teach themselves English. I don't feel comfortable calling myself an English teacher because a lot of the time they know more about the grammar than I do, even as a native speaker, because I've never had to learn it, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same for me in Polish, you know, or even in Spanish. Like I've forgotten a lot of the grammar that I learned, and in Polish, I mean, we did study grammar in high school and things like that, but you know, I never think about it. So I also find it interesting that, for example, in English, when students ask me, you know, so teacher, how else can I use this word? Can you give me some examples? I come up with examples like this just because I've been asked this question a million times. Whereas in Polish, for my girlfriend is learning Polish at the moment, and sometimes she asks me, well, how else can I use this word? Or what are the collocations? And I'm like, I'm not sure. Let me think about it. It's just because nobody has ever asked me this question, you know, and it's, so I find it interesting as well that it's perhaps not, you know, it's not only your proficiency in the language, but it's also your language awareness.
Which is a skill that you've developed, right?
I think so. You develop it through your, I suppose, degree. If you do a master's in teaching English or something like this, you will develop a lot of language awareness through also studying and analyzing the language, and then also being in the classroom. Your experience contributes to it because your students keep on asking you the same questions, and after say 10 years of teaching English, you've heard most questions that students come up with, and then you've got these answers, you've got all the examples and things like that. So that makes a huge difference as well.
So why are English learners and English schools and even content creators like myself obsessed with talking about the native English speaker or the native English teacher?
I think because on the face of it, it makes a lot of intuitive sense, if you see what I mean. I mean, if you ask anyone, who would you like to learn Chinese from, a Chinese teacher or a Polish teacher? Everybody will say a Chinese teacher, right? There is something that intuitively makes sense about it. We all seem to think that a native speaker of a language is the ultimate goal and speaks the language flawlessly, has the intuitive feel for the language, and so on, right? We could go on for a long time. There are all these, there is this halo effect, I think, about, native speakers. But then when we start looking more deeply into it, and I'm sure we're gonna go into that, it starts making much less sense. But I think on the face of it, it does make a lot of sense, and that's why it's just an easier to market product, I would say. And also in some countries like Poland in the early 90s, or still Italy, Spain, France, unfortunately, there are a lot of local teachers whose proficiency level is rather low.
Yep.
Or what happens is, in Poland, for example, the teaching profession is so badly paid that a lot of people who learn really good English in university, who maybe even study to become English teachers, they decide to go into business
because they can earn
5 times as much. Yeah, there's so what happens, especially in smaller cities or in worse schools, is that you get people who can speak a little bit of English and they become English teachers, right? And that obviously creates, I think, when students have these teachers for years, they kind of think all non-native speakers are like that.
Yeah.
They can't teach me anything, right?
So it becomes like a stereotype.
Yeah, I think so. And before going live, we talked about, stereotypes about other people. We all have stereotypes, whether we like it or not. Pick any country, right, that you want, and you will have stereotypes about these people, good and bad stereotypes.
Well, it sucks so hard because it's evolutionarily it makes sense to have those stereotypes, because I think it's that false negative versus a positive negative, right? Where if you hear a tiger in the woods, it's much better to assume it's a tiger and it not be, than for you to assume it's not a tiger and for it to be a tiger, right? So it tends to be...
Absolutely, yeah.
That's why we have all of those, assumptions. I see a black person and I have certain assumptions. I see an Asian person, I have certain assumptions. But yeah, it sucks that it's very hard for us to get past. But obviously that's a big part of it with teaching English, and not just assuming that non-natives are, not good teachers.
Yeah. And I think also what's fueling this demand, I think it's also the way the schools advertise themselves that obviously further fuels the demand. It's kind of a chicken and egg question. What came first, the demand from clients or advertising? But I think once this started, it just creates a vicious circle in a way, because if you have a language school and for the last 10 years your unique selling point has been we have native speakers, you can't all of a sudden change this, because obviously your clients will be disappointed.
Exactly.
I mean, I often give the analogy of, imagine going into an Apple store and you want an Apple phone. You've wanted an Apple phone for the last 5 years. And they tell you in the store that, sorry, we don't do Apple phones anymore. We only have Huawei.
It's like going to
You'd be like, whoa, is this a joke? And it's not that
yeah,
Huawei is a
yeah,
worse phone. It's a fantastic phone, but it's not what you've been promised, right?
yeah.
So
It'd be like going to a Bruce Willis film and it's a romantic, film instead of an action-packed thriller.
yeah,
And you're like,
exactly,
what is
exactly.
this?
So I think I've spoken to quite a few directors, and they're kind of, they're honest about it as well. They're saying that I think we've created a rod for our own back, where
Hmm.
we've fueled this demand, and now we're trying to change things and give all teachers equal opportunities. But it's really hard because
Yep.
we've now all our students want native speakers, but it's because we've been using this as a unique selling point for the last 20 years. So
That is screwed up, right? If it's almost like a medicine that doesn't work and you're like, guys, stop buying it, stop buying it. But it's like, we
yeah,
sell it because they buy it, and they buy it because we keep selling it, So
yeah.
what is currently being done? What are you guys doing at TEFL Equity Advocates and Academy to try and break this vicious cycle?
Well, I try to raise awareness as much as possible, and for example, through weekly blog posts, podcasts like this one, going to conferences and meeting school directors and talking to them, helping them. A lot of them do want to change their recruitment policies. It's just that they're not sure how to do it.
So they are aware
And
of it.
yeah, I think in the last 5 years or six, since I started the website and the movement, if you want to call it a movement, a lot has changed, especially in terms of awareness. That a lot of people in our profession are really aware that this is a problem and we
Yeah.
need to do something about it. But now, how do we go about doing something? But in some countries like Spain, for example, a lot is changing now. So there are more and more schools who recognize that hiring someone just because they are a native speaker and they have a
Hmm.
4-week crash course in teaching English, it doesn't make any sense. It's not gonna help the students improve their English. You need to hire somebody who's highly qualified, experienced, and proficient. And also, a lot of school directors start realizing that they've been basically limiting their recruitment to a small percentage of all English teachers that are available, for example, in the EU, because probably 80-90% of all the teachers probably around the world are non-native speakers, right?
Well, and
So
obviously they're missing out on probably the most important metric there, which is quality of teaching, as opposed to
yeah,
which home country do they have, or what's their accent, or where did they grow up.
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if your main hiring criteria is the teacher's first language, then surely you're missing out on some incredibly highly qualified, experienced teachers who will make your school much, much better.
So what is it that makes a good teacher, whether non-native or native? What sort of attributes should people listening to this podcast who are currently getting lessons or going to classes, what should be the things that they try and look out for in their teacher, whether native or not?
So, for me as a polyglot, one of the, I wouldn't say number one, number two, number three, but one of the most important things is that the teacher has learned another language
Why is
to a
that not
relatively
focused
high
on?
degree of
Yeah,
proficiency.
why is that
Um,
not focused on? Sorry to interrupt you there, but that really gets my it grinds my gears. The other day I was watching a video from a pretty popular language English teaching person on YouTube, and they were saying, I'm an expert in teaching languages, I'm an expert in English learning, except I've never learned a foreign language. And I was just like, that how does it's like I'm an expert in running marathons, I've just never run one. It
yeah.
blows my mind that more English teachers aren't pushed to do that or push themselves. Like that's a big motivation for me to learn foreign languages like French and Portuguese, because I want to have experienced what my students have experienced through learning English and understand the pain, at least, even if they're at a much
Hmm.
higher level, right? So why don't we hold a lot of English teachers to that sort of account, that level of skill,
Yeah,
that skill set?
absolutely. For me, it should be one of the basic criteria, really, that you've learned. Like, I don't mean that you have to become completely proficient, but at least you have to become fairly fluent in a language. I mean, it's a good analogy with marathon, or imagine going to the gym, and you get a new trainer, and the trainer is showing you how to do push-ups and stuff like this, but they've never done a push-up in their
Yeah.
life.
I only use the other machine where I do them like this. I don't actually do push-ups, but this is how you would do them.
Yeah, exactly. That's what this. I read this book the other day, and that's I can show you the drawing. That's how you're supposed to do the push-up. Now go and do it.
But how come you don't do it? Ain't nobody got time for that.
Yeah. So yeah, I think look out for teachers who have learned a foreign language, who are actively trying to learn foreign languages. I think that's really, really important, because, as you said, it gives the teacher the kind of an insider's perspective into what it's like to learn a language. And so that's really
I had
important.
answers to questions all the time when people started asking me, how do I learn the present perfect? It wasn't go and look up the stuff online or go to a book. I could actually give them, meaningful information about how I learnt the equivalent tense in Portuguese or in French, what exercises I would do, how I would try and, research it or learn it or apply it. And that tended to be a lot more fruitful than just pointing them in the direction of go watch this 10-minute video and you'll be sweet.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd say the second important thing is obviously qualifications.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to learn a language or train in a gym from someone who maybe is very, very fit, but they don't have any education in physical education, right? They haven't done a degree in it, or they haven't done a good training course, because it can be dangerous. There's a lot of myths about training in the gym, and a lot of exercises that turn out to be dangerous. So I think you want a gym trainer who's fit, who's exercising themselves, but who's also got some education in sports. I think that's really important. It's the same here. I think you want a teacher who has some training or some education in teaching English. And and courses like CELTA and Trinity Cert, there's nothing wrong with them, but you also have to know that a lot of teachers do a 4-week course, right? And after a 4-week course, they're qualified teachers. Think about going to a lawyer who's just done a 4-week course and a qualified lawyer. I don't know. I don't know of any other profession where the entry level is so low. And I think, that's a problem. I'm not saying don't learn from teachers like that. I'm not saying that, but I think it's something to consider that, a lot of teachers only do a 4-week course and that's it. Right.
I guess the hard part is that they are fluent in the language, right? Like, without trying to break the analogy of the lawyer, it'd be like they were really good in the court, but they just went into autopilot whenever they went into court, right? There was no studying beforehand or helping work out your case. It would just be, let's show up and we'll get it done. Fingers crossed.
Yeah. It's, 4 weeks is barely enough. It's a crash course, really. The third thing could be experience as well. That would be another thing that I'd say is important. Obviously teachers who have more experience, they might be better teachers as well. That's not to discourage you from studying with someone who's just starting out. They might be a great teacher. They might be very passionate, and and you together might work really well. But experience would obviously be another factor that you want to consider. And then the teachers we had qualifications, experience, skills. That was another thing I want to say, skills. So, proficiency level in English, if you're high level, you want a teacher who's very high level in English. I mean, if your English if you're just a complete beginner, you don't need somebody who's completely proficient. You could very well study from someone who's intermediate, right?
Yeah.
Another thing I think that's really important and you shouldn't overlook is your specific needs, right? So what do you need English for? Say you've just moved to Australia and maybe you're going to work for a company where you're going to give a lot of sales presentations, right? Well, you don't want just any English teacher. I think you want someone who has experience teaching people how to give sales presentations, right? They don't necessarily have to have experience in business, previous experience in business. They should be a qualified English teacher, but at the same time, they should have experience teaching other English learners how to achieve the things that you want to achieve. If you want to pass an exam, look for a teacher who's got a good track record preparing students for that exam. I think that's much more important than where the teacher comes from, right?
Well, I
If you
know.
want to, yeah.
Sorry, you keep going. Sorry.
No, you go on.
Well, I know that you're an IELTS and PET examiner, or at least you were in the past.
I was, yeah.
What do you think of certain English teachers who say don't study for the exams, just study English? Because I hear both sides quite often, and my advice to people generally, to put myself on the line, is study to pass the exam. Don't study to try and just, broadly improve your English, because it's a less effective way of passing what's on it. You can have horrible English and still smash the exam, whereas you could have amazing English and do horribly on the exam, which is why natives quite often get 6.5 on the IELTS, right?
Yeah. I mean, I guess it depends what's your goal, right? If your goal is to pass the exam because you need it for visa reasons, then you need to study for the exam. There's no way around it, because as you said, your English can be fantastic, but you will still get a lower grade because you don't know anything about the exam. If your goal is to improve your overall level of English, I probably wouldn't choose to study for the exam. I would do other things. Personally, it doesn't motivate me. Having said that, I did the proficiency exam, the C2 exam, both in English and in Spanish. And it definitely allowed me to push my language level to yet another dimension.
How do they differ from IELTS and PET, for example, those C2 exams?
So they're much more general English. In English is the certificate of proficiency in English. It's also done by Cambridge.
Yeah.
And it's on a certain level. It's on C2 level, whereas IELTS is all levels. You can get A1, the complete beginner, or complete proficiency. It depends. And IELTS is much more academic, whereas the certificate of proficiency in English is much more general English. I mean, I say general, but the things that you learn, your average native speaker on the street will have no clue what that is. They might have seen that word once in their life in a novel by Charles Dickens, but that's the sort of language that you learn. I mean, I remember when I was in Costa Rica at the time, and I was preparing for the Spanish proficiency exam, and I started making fun of people. I would just kind of ask my friends from Costa Rica if they knew what that word or phrase mean. And most of the time they would just say, no, that word doesn't exist. I was like, yeah, it does exist. I just learned it yesterday for this exam. Oh, you're learning useless stuff. Nobody knows that word.
I saw you holding a book in your image on Facebook that was by Christopher Hitchens. How have you gone with his English? Because that is a freaking nightmare for any. I am PhD educated, and I would highlight probably 2 or 3 words a page in Christopher Hitchens' books. So.
Yeah. No, it's a kind of it's a different level of it's different English that you're learning, I suppose, that you're not going to need for your daily life. I think that's another point. Again, if you need to, if you want to learn a language effectively, you need to identify what your goals are. Do you need to give business presentations, or do you want to interact with, you're already in Australia and you want to interact with your Australian friends on an informal level? What do you want to do? Because you can't learn their language. It doesn't exist. It's impossible to learn everything, right?
Well, even for me, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So what would your advice be? You imagine you've got a twin that's coming to Australia tomorrow and doesn't speak a lick of English, speaks barely anything. What would be the sort of trajectory or plan of attack that you would put them on to get to your current level, or even my level in Australian English? What would be the sort of plan?
Yeah, I think, what I normally do when I start with a new language is, for example, to start with the most kind of common icebreaker questions, things that I would want to ask other people, like, where are you from? What do you do? What are your hobbies and stuff like this? And I'll write these down, and then start a language exchange immediately as well, as soon as you can. At that point, if you don't speak any any English or any of the target language, you need someone as well who can speak one of the languages that you speak, so you can translate and stuff like this.
And would
I
you
think you
recommend
need it.
finding a non-native speaker of English who's also learning English, or perhaps at a higher level to practice with? Or would you?
Absolutely, yeah. Why not?
Yeah,
Why not? I think that would be, if you can find someone who is from the same community as you are. Say you're from Poland, find another Polish person who's been living in Australia for a very long time,
yeah,
and they speak Australian English very well, because they will also be able to explain to you, what it was like for them, support you, and so on. Someone who hasn't gone through that process won't be able to do that, right? So that could
yeah,
be very important, especially at the beginning. But you could find, an Australian person who speaks one of the languages that you do, to help you translate at the beginning. So I think tip number one would be to, write down the kind of the most useful questions that you want to ask people. Start a language exchange immediately. Find things that you enjoy doing and try doing them in your target language, so in English. So say you like watching, I don't know, cooking shows, right? Go and do that in English. Even if you don't
exactly.
understand much, start with it, put on subtitles, and watch that in English as much as possible. Another thing to do that a lot of polyglots, I think, do is, for example, if you like books, but it also works with films, series, pick something that you've seen or read many times.
Yeah, this is
So
why Harry
say,
Potter's so popular with polyglots, right?
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Pick because then you will know the characters, the story, what's happening. You probably even remember what people say in each of the scenes, right?
And that was the key to me. Like, I have, what have I got here? Uh, L'Autre de Phoenix. And
Okay.
I remember reading all these Harry Potter books in French when I was going hard on French, and just being like, oh man, this is so easy. Like, you don't realize how many of these words are new because you remember what's going on, the context and everything, and you're just like, oh yeah, that's right. So it is a great way of picking up and sort of zooming through these things, doing that
Yeah,
repetition, right?
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, try to find a routine as well, like how you can insert the new language into your daily life. So for example, you could, I don't know, say you commute every day for half an hour,
Yeah.
decide that every day in the morning you're going to listen to a podcast or read your Harry Potter book, or watch a YouTube video, do 10 minutes of Memrise or Quizlet or something like this to learn new vocabulary, whatever that is. But try and make it fun as well. So
So
don't.
what would you say, though, to those people who are saying, I'm doing all this stuff and I'm not getting anywhere? What do I need to do? Because, you were saying before doing the C2 exams in English and Spanish, you weren't at the level that obviously after having studied for those exams you got to. A lot of the English speakers and my students who listen to the podcast give me those sorts of questions of, I've been here for 5 years and my English still sucks. I'm listening to your podcast, it still sucks. What is the way for them to get out of that intermediate plateau where I assume they are, to get to an advanced level? Do they need to do something like just do one of these exams, even if it's useless and they don't need it for anything, to just push them to take
Yeah.
that final leap?
I think it's difficult to generalize, because we would kind of have to go case by case. I mean, how often do you use English in your daily life? Because you might be living in Australia, but maybe you're surrounded by
Yeah.
other Polish speakers, right? And you don't use it that much on your daily life. I think that there is a level where you need to try and push yourself. So what you need to try and do is, if you're at that kind of upper intermediate level, you can probably say everything that you want to say, but you need to push yourself. So you need to try and write down some new expressions and use them, for
Yeah.
example, or be it in speaking or when writing an email or whatever, or try to imitate other people, so imitate the people that, if you want to speak like them, use the same expressions, and actively try to push yourself, because that there is a certain level where you kind of feel like, well, I'm not making any progress.
Yeah.
And also I think, when we were talking about polyglots before, it does feel for other people, when they look at polyglots, they think, well, these people are just incredibly talented, or it just happens magically, right?
Yeah.
Because it's, you look at, I don't know, somebody like Roger Federer or Rafa Nadal, and you think like, wow, I can never be like them. That's just impossible.
Would it be
But
better than
it's
that? It'd be
because,
someone who's a decathlete or something, right? It's not just someone like Roger
yeah,
Federer, who's an amazing tennis player. It's someone who can do 10 different, sports to a very high level.
absolutely. Yeah. But I think the point I wanted to make is that, it doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without kind of, you know, studying, in the sense that maybe, you sit down every day and you do half an hour of memorize to learn 20 new words or something like this. I mean, unless you have some incredible memory, you're not going to pick it up just magically,
This is sort of like what you were saying about the non-native and native speakers. Do you think that that English learners and language learners have been sold too many of these be fluent in 3-month courses, or just listen to a podcast to get fluent? And so they think the process is actually a lot easier than it really is, and don't appreciate how much they do have to just get down, study and grind to get to those upper echelons.
Yeah, perhaps there is that as well. That, I think the reason why a lot of those courses are sold as like, it's going to be easy and fun, because a lot of people have learned the language in a very painful way. So
Yeah.
I think it can still be fun, but you have to do stuff in the language. I mean, unless you completely immerse yourself, so that means basically 24/7. You watch films, you read books, and you speak as well in that language, and you write. You're not going to see that much improvement, because again, you can be, let's say, come back to my example of Spanish. Over the last, when did I do the proficiency exam? It was in 2011. So It's been, Jesus, almost 10 years now. I don't think my Spanish has got any better.
Yeah.
I would say that now, if I had to do that exam, I might fail. And it's because, I'm not actively doing anything.
And it would be exactly the same for Roger Federer, not training tennis, or even just having a hit on the weekend, but not doing deliberate practice to try and, maintain such an athletic level of that thing, right? He's going to drop off straight away too. He probably doesn't train for 2 weeks. He's probably going to be in trouble, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And perhaps, you hit the nail on the head there with deliberate practice. It's not that Roger Federer just plays tennis with his mates. He does.
I just go out on weekends,
practice.
And that's how I got to where I am.
Yeah, maybe he needs to improve the spin on his forehand or something like this, and he will do 1,000 hits of that. And learning a language is different from learning a skill, but
well, it is a skill though, right? It's still, there are a lot of parallels.
Yeah, I think there are. And so, say you want to be better able to have very fluent, informal, colloquial conversation with your Australian friends. Well, that's your target practice. Listen to those conversations, write down some target vocabulary that you're going to use, and use them. Don't be afraid to make a fool out of yourself. Maybe Australian people will laugh at you because you used it wrongly, you said it wrongly, but then you will remember and try again, and that should be your focus. If you just kind of listen to podcasts or read books, that's not going to improve your informal, colloquial conversation abilities, right?
Well, you may be able to understand a lot more, but you're doing a lot of passive practice. You're not implementing. It's like watching tennis instead of actually playing it, right? You're like, I can see all these moves. Yeah, but you can't hit them back. So some rapid fire ones. These are some cliches that get thrown out all over the internet, native, non-native English teacher wise. Embrace your mistakes. Should you be doing that?
What do you mean by embracing your mistakes?
Well, quite often a lot of people will say you need to learn to love your mistakes. That's what's going to help you improve your English. Mm-hmm. Do you think that that's a good message to be sending? Does it make sense? Is there something deeper in there that people aren't really articulating very well?
I think it probably again depends on your current attitude to mistakes. So and how many mistakes you make. Because if your attitude is I don't care about mistakes, and you make a lot of mistakes to such a degree where it impedes communication, then you clearly need to pay a lot of more attention to them. On the other spectrum, you obviously have people who pay so much attention to being correct that they're afraid to speak because they're afraid of making mistakes.
It's
and
that's paralysis really from analysis, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think you want to be somewhere in the middle. When it's important, pay attention to your mistakes, try to write them down, and don't beat yourself down that you've made a mistake. We've all made terrible terrible mistakes in a foreign language.
I think that comes back to the deliberate learning point that you were making before, where the mistakes, you don't need to love them or hate them, but you need to use them as a chance to learn and improve, and then focus on deliberate learning, where, say, for instance, with my wife, we speak only Portuguese at home. And every time at least most of the time, when I don't know how to say something, instead of just, saying the English word in a Portuguese sentence and inserting it, I'll try and describe it or ask her, how can I say this? I won't just avoid my mistakes or, try and hide from them. It's more like trying to embrace that and just be like, look, I don't know. How do I say this? Look, I don't know. How do I say this?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think the most important thing is to, don't beat yourself down. Don't be frustrated that you've made a mistake, equally, don't pay so much attention to your mistakes that it stops you from speaking. It depends what level you're on as well.
Well, have you ever made a mistake, Marek?
Of course.
Have you ever had someone heard you make a mistake and say, you are an idiot and your English sucks?
I can't remember with English, but I can remember a very embarrassing mistake in Spanish, for example.
But still, did that not just break the ice? That's sort of like, oh, it's funny, or was it like, because I'm trying to get at here is that I have a lot of friends who say I don't want to make mistakes because I don't want people to get angry at me or frustrated or criticize me for my English, and I'm like, man, I just don't ever see that happening. I don't ever feel that. If you make a mistake with me, my first reaction isn't, oh my God, this guy's a freaking moron. It's, this guy isn't speaking his native language. We'll give him a pass, So that was sort of the point I was getting at there.
Yeah, no, I think, most people are, especially if you do language exchanges and things like that, most people are incredibly friendly, and
exactly.
Nobody's going to laugh at your mistakes. Or
what about the line, don't learn grammar? Don't ever focus on learning grammar.
I don't know. I mean, I think we're speaking with kind of like, imperatives, and we're making it black and white. For example, here in Belgium, in Flanders, in the Flemish part of Belgium, people start learning English when they are 12 in school, formally, right? By that time, everybody is fluent in English. I mean, here, it's like
kidding.
In Scandinavia, literally everybody speaks very, very good English.
To pause you, sorry, why is that? Yeah, what are they doing prior to lessons?
I'm trying to get to that.
Sorry.
And so all TV here is subtitled. There is no dubbing, doesn't exist. So when I was working here in the University of Leuven, I would ask my students, I was so amazed with their English, and I'd ask them, how on earth did you learn that? Where did you pick it up? And they were like, I really don't know. I can't tell you. They're basically, they're a little bit like native speakers, that they don't know anything about the grammar of English. You tell them you should use present perfect, they look at you as if you're from Mars. Right?
Yeah,
they have no idea what you're talking about. They're all incredibly fluent, and I think it comes down to this incredible amount of exposure as young children, and teenagers. That's where it comes from. So you can reach very, very high degrees of proficiency without studying any grammar. And there is little evidence in second language acquisition research that deliberate study of grammar has any long-term improvement on your accuracy or your that it leads to acquisition. What really leads to acquisition is incredible amounts of exposure to that language. For example, practice in the sense of doing meaningful tasks in that language. I think another problem that there is with teaching grammar is, say, for you I don't know if you learned French like that, but I hope you didn't. But
I did.
A lot of the times
did.
the teacher will make you conjugate the subjunctive for all persons. Yeah. You want to shoot yourself because you're like,
and from memory, they won't even say, write it out or whatever. They'll be like, say them now, then just two, and then they're just like,
yeah. But you don't need to know it. I mean, you don't need to know the subjunctive for all persons for all verbs, because you're very unlikely to use it.
Well, this is the Pareto principle, right? Too, where it's not a linear sort of distribution of how often every single word or every grammatical tense or whatever in a language is used. It's not all equal across the board. It tends to be that the 20% will be used 80% of the time, and then the rest tails off pretty quickly. I found the same in Portuguese. I'm constantly asking my wife, ironically, I'll say to her, "Is this the right way to say it?" And she'll be like, "Yeah, you said it fine." And I'll be like, "How did I learn that? I don't remember studying that, and I've just picked it up from somewhere." But also I'll ask her about, technically I should be using the subjunctive here, right? And she'll just be like, "No one does that. Like, ignore the rules. Stop, get out of your grammar book and just talk."
Yeah. I think, when grammar practice will be helpful is when you've identified that you have a problem that leads maybe especially to a communicative breakdown or stops you from doing what you need to do in English, right? So then that can really help you, that you've identified, okay, I don't know how to say the second conditional phrase. I want to talk about an imaginary situation. I want to say, if I had a lot of money, I would, and you don't know how to say that. Well, then you can focus on that structure. But again, don't study it for 5 hours for all the possible verbs and stuff like this. Do the ones that are most common, I think, and most useful to you. So that much more focused grammar practice when needed, I think is more effective.
I kind of treat it like a video game where when I'm playing, if I get stuck somewhere and I repeatedly can't get past a certain level, I'm not just going to throw the game out or ignore it. I just look it up on YouTube, or I do some research to try and find the answer so that I can get through it and move on. And I kind of treat it the same way. If I keep coming up against a certain thing that I'm trying to say in Portuguese or French, and I keep making the mistake or even just second guessing myself in the moment, thinking, I don't know how to do this, that's when I go away and start practicing it or look it up and then try and utilize it, do some Anki or whatever repetition exercises. And then I find quite often I'm out of that sort of, I'm over that obstacle within a few days or weeks.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's great.
What do you think in terms of pronunciation? We'll finish up shortly, but how much emphasis needs to be put on learning pronunciation, especially if you're a non-native English teacher? Because I'm sure that a lot of teachers worry a lot about how well they can pronounce, English just as much as their grammar or sentence structure, right?
Well, I think you need to have intelligible pronunciation, and by that I mean that you have a clear voice and you're easy to understand to a wide variety of speakers. And from the learner's perspective, if you're wondering, well, can I learn good pronunciation from a non-native speaker? Shouldn't I get a native speaker teacher? I think you have to bear in mind that there's a lot of second language acquisition research that shows that the vast majority of adult learners will never be able to reach native level of pronunciation, that you will never be able to pass off for a native speaker.
Well, why would you? That shouldn't be the goal, right? Your goal isn't to mimic a native speaker. I want to be a spy.
I'm saying it because I know that, perhaps for some of your listeners, and I've heard it a lot from students, they do want that. A lot of people want that. They've been sold that idea. It's the same for me.
Learning French or Portuguese, I'm constantly criticizing myself, but having to remind myself, that my ultimate goal isn't to be mistaken as a Brazilian or mistaken as a French person. It's to get my ideas across and communicate clearly, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Because for example, with my Spanish or with my English, there are times where for the first minute or two, people can't identify where I'm from. But then eventually they'll ask you, so where are you from? Right? Yeah. Not necessarily thinking that you're a non-native speaker, but well, what are you going to say at that point? You're going to pretend you're from Australia? No. Well, you're going to tell them I'm French, I'm Polish, I'm Chinese, screw with them. Right?
You just say to them, yeah I'm Australian. With this thick Indian accent. Yeah.
So I think, your accent is just a natural part of who you are as a user of that language. And there's no reason to be ashamed of how you sound. Say, you sound French when you speak English. Well, you are French,
Yeah.
If that French accent doesn't make you less clear, that's fine. There's no problem with having an accent. I think the goal should be intelligible pronunciation, and you can learn that from a native or a non-native speaker. It really doesn't matter.
When it's the same with native speakers, if I go out into rural Australia, I'll meet people who have very thick accents, and it takes me a while to acclimate and get used to them. But also, I get frustrated if I can't understand them, and they're Australian. And it's the same with foreigners learning English. I don't get annoyed because they have the slightest accent, even though I can 100% understand them. I would get annoyed and frustrated, not necessarily with them, but with the situation, if their accent was so thick that communication was impeded and I couldn't understand what was going on. And I think that's what, you need to just make sure you get out of the woods, out of that part, right, to be able to communicate. And you don't have to worry about pulling yourself, to the point of being an Australian or mistaken for an Australian or an American or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you don't. It's changing your accent completely. It's like changing who you are in a way. And you might have heard that quote from David Crystal, who's a famous, very very famous English linguist, probably the most famous one in the English speaking world. And he once said that there's only one type of people who need to completely be able to get rid of their foreign accent, and these are spies.
And they still get caught.
Yeah, they still get caught. But there it's a matter of life and death, right?
Exactly.
You don't want to get caught with a foreign accent. For everybody else, I mean, it really doesn't matter. But I get that feeling that, when I was learning English and then Spanish, I did aim for trying to sound like a native speaker. And there is this kind of, I don't know, it's a nice feeling where sometimes people can't tell where you're from.
Yeah, for sure.
But now, my attitude is completely different. When I'm learning, I now have to speak a lot of French because I go to work in Brussels. My aim is not to speak like them. My aim is to, as long as my pronunciation is clear and they're able to understand me, I'm fine. That, I have a Polish accent. So what? I'm Polish after all, so I'm not going to hide by behind a fake Belgian or French identity, right? So
it must get pretty confusing though after your sixth language,
Yeah.
Final question: what advice would you have for any of the listeners that are learning English, listening to this podcast, and thinking now after this conversation, I might actually try and become an English teacher?
Well, go for it. Go for it. It's I love teaching people. And I think it's a great profession to be in. Get trained up and why not do it? There's so many possibilities. You can stay in your home country. You can travel the world. There's there are no limits really. You can teach online, and it's an amazing feeling when you're helping other people improve. Be it I think I'd love any kind of teaching, not just teaching a language, but it's amazing when you have when you're working with somebody and you see how they progress. Definitely. Every week, and how they get better, and it's so yeah. No, I think go for it if that's what you want to do.
And where can they find your resources, which are specifically created to help such people become good English teachers?
So you can visit my website, TEFLequityadvocates.com. That's where I host a weekly blog. There are resources for English teachers, PDF guides, lesson plans, and there are also training courses there and webinars.
Brilliant. Well, Marek, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks a lot, Pete.